is all about algebraic fractions or rational expressions. These terms are interchangeable. So let's define an algebraic fraction or rational expression. It's just simply a fraction with a variable in the numerator and or denominator. And the reason I have these little kind of joke things on your notes, your initial set of notes, is because division by zero is not allowed. So whenever you have a fraction with a variable in the denominator, you have to make sure that you don't have a value that would give the denominator or make the denominator zero. So what we call excluded values are variable values that would make the denominator zero. So we're now dealing with fractions. We're dealing with fractions that have variables in the numerator and or the denominator. And when you have a fraction with a variable in the denominator, you have to make sure that you exclude values that would make that denominator zero. So we call these values excluded values. And the homework, the initial homework set, is all about just simply identifying these excluded values. So the first few problems for learning are set up with variables in the denominator. So problem number 1, the denominator is x plus 5. The way I identify the excluded value, I take the denominator, I set it equal to 0, and I see that x equals negative 5. So the value of negative 5 would make this expression have no meaning whatsoever. So negative 5 would be what we call an excluded value, a value that's not allowed. So x cannot equal negative 5. So beside the x cannot equal, you would write negative 5 because that's the value that makes the denominator 0. Moving on to number 2, the denominator is x minus 7. If x minus 7 equals 0, that means x has a value of 7. So my excluded value for number 2 would be positive 7. X is not allowed to equal positive 7. Moving on to number 3, well, if x plus 3 equals 0, then x itself would be negative 3. So that means for this problem, the excluded value would be negative 3, because negative 3 would make this a meaningless expression because I would have division by 0. Number 4, well, the denominator is simply 3 times x. If 3 times x equals 0, then if I divide both sides by 3 or multiply by 1/3, that leaves me with x equals 0. Therefore, x is not allowed to equal 0, because if it did, 3 times 0 would be 0, and I would have a meaningless expression with 0 in the denominator. Number 5 is the exact same setup, so x is not allowed to equal 0. In a problem like number 6, I have a variable in the numerator and no variable in the denominator. So for number 6, there are no numerator can be anything. The only variable value I'm worried about is the value in the denominator. So this problem has no excluded values because you have no variable in the denominator. The next problem set, you're asked to simplify and list excluded values. And this is what we'll be working on this week whenever we return to school, next week rather. So looking at problem number 1, I'm going to go ahead and factor the numerator, meaning I'm just going to break it down into its factored pieces. If I remove a positive 6, then the numerator looks like 6 times the binomial x plus 6, and then my denominator is x plus 6. So in this problem, the value that's not allowed is -6. Because if x itself is -6, if I'm looking at just my denominator, if x plus 6 equals 0, that's true when x is -6. So that means x equaling -6 is an excluded value. So I factor it, I list the excluded values, and then I come back to the original equation and I simplify or remove the common factors. So this is something that we'll focus on in school whenever we return together as a class. But here I have a common factor of x plus 6 on top and bottom, so my simplified answer is +6. So taking away from this video, the most important thing you can learn in this video is just how to identify the excluded values, and we will work on simplifying in class together. Number 2, the excluded value would be 0. So x is not allowed to equal 0 because x is sitting alone in the denominator. To simplify this, to remove the common factor of x, I'm left with 8. In number 3, I'm going to factor the numerator. The numerator is 5 times x plus 2, and the denominator is x plus 2. So my excluded value, I'm going to color code it, my excluded value would be the value that would make the denominator 0. So x is not allowed to equal -2. And then when I come back to simplify the problem, to remove the common factor, I would remove the factor of x plus 2, and my simplified answer would be 5. Number 4, if I remove a 10 from the denominator, I'm left with 2x plus 3. To figure out what the excluded value is, if I set 2x plus 3 equal to 0, and then if I multiply by 1/2, since this is the value that would make the denominator 0, this is my excluded value. So x is not allowed to equal -3/2. Then I look at my expression in its factored form. The factor of 10 is common to top and bottom, so my simplified answer is 1 over 2x plus 3. Number 5, you can see how they start to get a little bit harder, and this is what we'll focus on together in class. But in number 5, let's copy the numerator, and then let's factor the denominator. The denominator is x plus 2 times x minus 2. So to list my excluded values, I have to take each factor in the denominator. If x plus 2 equals 0, x cannot or x would equal -2. And if x minus 2 equals 0, then x equals 2. So my 2 excluded values are the values that would make each factor in the denominator 0. So here, x is not allowed to equal +2, and it's not allowed to equal -2. So once I factor the denominator, decide which values are not allowed because they would cause division by 0, then I can come back and remove the factors that they share. And this would simplify as 1 over x minus 2. That would be my simplified answer. Number 6 is set up very much like number 5. Number 6, let's factor the denominator first. So here's my numerator, x plus 5. The denominator is x plus 5 times x minus 5. So let's determine excluded values. So I will take the first factor. If x plus 5 is 0, that means x is -5. And if x minus 5 is set equal to 0, that means x is +5. So my excluded values, x is not allowed to equal +5, nor is it allowed to equal -5. So I factored it, I've listed my excluded values, and now I look for common factors. So here my common factor is the binomial x plus 5. And then what's left over is 1 over x minus 5. Looking at your homework, really all I would like for you to do is just simply list the excluded values. And then we will simplify these together in class. Number 1 is easy enough. Let's look at number 2. All I'm concerned about is determining when 6n minus 2 equals 0, which value of n would make that true. So my excluded value for number 2 is n is not allowed to equal 1/3. So for this homework set, all I want you to do is look at the denominator and set it equal to 0, and then list the value that would make the denominator 0. List that as the excluded value. So if 27x plus 27 equals 0, that means x has a value of -1. Therefore, x is not allowed to equal -1. Number 4 has no excluded values because there are no variables in the denominator. So all I want you to do in numbers 1 through 15 is simply look at each denominator and factor it if necessary. Number six would need to be factored. They share 2x. Let me clear the screen and I'll do this simpler. Number 6, if I remove, and I'm just focusing on the denominator only, if I remove 2x, that leaves me with 7x minus 8. And all I'm looking for are the x values that would make the denominator 0. I have 2 factors here. So if 2x equals 0, that means x itself is 0. And if 7x minus 8 equals 0, that means 7x equals 8. X is 8 over 7. So these would be the 2 values not allowed. X is not allowed to equal 0. X is not allowed to equal 8 over 7. And I will let you try the rest on your own.